You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Tomorrow Society podcast. This is your host, Dan Heaton. And first of all, I would like to apologize because it's been a long time since we did our last episode here on the show, and that was not by design. It's amazing how challenging and difficult it can be just to live life when you're trying to do things that have nothing to do with theme parks and podcasts. But everything's going really well, and I'm excited to bring you this episode, and also hoping that as I get into the new year to have a lot more content. So the show is not dead. It's moving on, and I hope it's going to go really well as we get into next year. And so my guest today, I'm really excited to have Sam Gennawey back on the podcast. He just wrote a new book that came out very recently called Jaybangs, which is about Jay Stein, who was a very important figure in the theme park industry. He worked at Universal for many years, was involved both with the growth of the studio tour in Hollywood and with the beginnings of Universal Studios Florida. It's a really fascinating book because it has so many interesting anecdotes. Something we didn't even talk about, Sam and I, is that Jay was really involved with the National Park Service and with MCA, who he worked for as above Universal, setting up trams in Washington, D.C. And there's so many different roads that are taken in this book, and I really highly recommend it. So it was really fun to talk to Sam once again. And we talk a lot about Universal and the differences between Universal and Disney. There's a lot of cool stuff in this conversation, and I hope you really enjoy it. And back to quickly, I want to say that if you like this show and you like this episode, please, the one thing you can do to help me out is to share it in social media, to rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever. That's going to be the best way that more people are going to find out about this podcast. It could lead to great guests like Sam, and it's going to be a win-win for all of us. So let's get to my conversation with Sam Gennawey, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, well, I am here with Sam Gennawey, who is the author of many books, but most recently Jaybangs, which is about Jay Stein, who's one of the great unknown architects of theme parks through MCA Universal. Sam, it is great to have you back on the podcast again.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
No problem. Well, last time you were on, which was about a little over a year ago, we talked about your book, Universal versus Disney, where you gave a pretty good background about Universal's history and how it connected to Disney. So after doing all that, what made you decide you wanted to get back into it for this book?
I was persuaded by a guy named Jay Stein. I had written Universal versus Disney. Throughout that entire story, whoever worked on the Universal parks, for the most part, had worked for Jay Stein. When Jay had retired in the mid-'90s, this guy really retired. He went away, didn't have a consulting firm, didn't do anything. He rented a house next door to Kevin Costner on the beach in Ventura, had enough money from the buyout from MCA, from the Japanese, and decided just to have a nice life. And he refused to talk to the press. He refused to talk to me for a long time when I was writing Universal versus Disney. I finished with that book, published it. He got a copy of it and then wrote me one day, and that's the opening of the book, which was that he had stories to tell, and it was time for him to finally tell it. The bottom line comes to, with the MCA culture, the Music Corporation of America, at the time it was the most powerful music or the most powerful entertainment company in the world, that the star was always the star. And at MCA, you dressed like a banker and you stood in the background and you pushed the star into the front. So it wasn't like at Disney, it was not like Jay was ever going to take credit, because that was very much not the way the company worked. So here's a guy that ran the Universal Parks from 1967 to 1993, and then turned the reins over to Ron Bensian, who ran the thing till about around 2000, and then Tom Williams, who runs the parks today. That's it. The parks have been run for about 3 people as compared to the many different managers who've gone through the Disney parks.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's Universal is often known as, well, they don't have any legacy, they just flip things around. They don't, it's Disney's known as the legacy group. But it's interesting reading this book that you have certain figures like Jay and then, some of his bosses like Lou Wasserman who are with MCA for so long and see it through so many different parts. That fascinates me because it almost flips things a little bit on its head in terms of how a lot of us look at Universal, I think.
It is, and when I had started writing the book, the premise that Universal was starting to really make an impact in the market, and here was an opportunity to explain the how and why, what made Universal different than Disney, and why the parks are competing the way that they are, and had come to the realization that although many people think because of the immersive environments, the Universal parks are becoming a lot more like the Disney parks, I tend to differ. I tend to actually think that the Disney parks are becoming a lot more like the Universal parks. The idea that there's a real focus on intellectual properties. Disney used to own all the things that it used to make rides for, and then it did a little outsourcing with the George Lucas stuff. But that was the whole thing with Universal. It was always about using other people's properties. And now both companies are constantly competing to see who can get the most prestigious intellectual property. It's an interesting battle between the two companies. I think one of the things that I did learn about it is that Disney did create, in a sense, a competitor that it didn't need to. In the mid-'80s, they did some things, and Universal could have just as easily gone a different direction. But Disney sort of pushed them into where they are today, so they created their own competition. And then many years later, the Universal is starting to live out what Jay's vision for the parks were because Comcast has the money to spend for it.
Right. And it's interesting because the title of the book is Jaybangs, but then it also says how Jay Stein, MCA, and Universal invented the modern theme park and beat Disney at his own game. And I wrote a review of your book, and I had a comment that someone just wrote, Universal didn't invent it, it was Disney. And I was like, well, that's the title of the book. But you make a good point in that, yes, Disneyland created a lot of what became the modern theme park. But if you're looking more specifically at how the attractions have evolved, I mean, you're looking at the Star Wars experience and what they've announced so far. Those sound like Universal rides, especially the one where you get out and they chase you around and you get back on. And that sounds like a high-tech version of a Universal ride, and I mean that in the best way possible. So it sounds like what the title is saying. One thing, it's very catchy, but also that in a sense, Universal kind of won the battle in terms of how rides were being created or attractions going forward.
Well, and it's even deeper than that, too. There's really is a big difference in the sense that when Walt Disney created, and I could say after writing 2 books about Disney as well, I think I understand it. And the thing is that in Jaybangs, one of the marketing people that worked with Universal had, I thought, made it very clear. He suggested that what Disney was great at doing was selling you the forest. What Universal was great at doing was selling you the trees. What Walt Disney wanted to do is he wanted to create an environment that allowed your lizard brain to relax. And through this architecture of reassurance, you're able to become more to your core center self, be able to communicate with other people, and have this sort of big, giant, warm, fuzzy hug throughout your entire visit so that you feel better about the world and elevated. Universal was never that way. Universal was first and foremost an opportunity to show you behind the scenes the way that the magic of movies and television was made. So at the beginning, it was very much an industrial tour first and foremost. And then second of all, as part of that industrial tour, the idea of these Jaybangs is an actual thing. Jaybangs is an element in a Universal show that puts the audience participant in a bit of peril, usually by shaking them, using real fire, putting them with water, somehow or other getting them scared so they get that little nervous laugh. They look at the person that they're with and they share that moment. It's a very different thing. The Disney rides were never like that until Universal started becoming very successful. And now the Disney rides are becoming like Universal. And the Disney rides, a lot of them now have Jaybangs. They just don't get it as well. So there's a real DNA difference between the two parks. that I think that have sort of merged and stuff that we're seeing today. But it's odd. And when I say that it's that Universal's winning, it is where the momentum is right now. Disney is starting to do things now. Of course, they're doing their own thing, which is how they deal with ticketing and stuff like that. In fact, the Universal parks are being run much more like the old-fashioned Disney parks, which was we're going to invest in capacity. We're going to keep building rides so that no matter how many people come, they have something to do. And Disney doesn't do that anymore. Disney sort of reduces rides, reduces capacity, and tries to keep guests busy doing other things. Do you see what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's odd in a weird sort of way. Universal is becoming very much like the old Disney parks as Disney parks move on to some other new world. But and also that was one of the other successful things that happened with Universal is they were forced with their contract with Harry Potter to use the set designers, Stuart Craig, the set designer for the first couple of Harry Potter movies. So like Walt Disney, instead of hiring architects to design his theme park, he used set designers to design Disneyland, which made things not work in the sense of an urban design, but it worked great for for a theme park. And Universal had to be forced to get a set designer who didn't quite understand urban planning, but he did understand what the storytelling of making place is. And that's why the shops are all undersized and everything like that, which adds to the atmosphere at the Universal parks. And now I think you're starting to see Disney starting to pick up on that as a design premise as well, after abandoning it for so many decades. So there you go. That's my overly thinking of the two different companies.
Well, I think I could ask like 12 follow-ups just from that spiel you just gave. I think that was really good. I think that's a very good way to sum it up. So the first thing, Jaybangs, at first when I saw that title, I hesitated. I was like, well, what does that mean? And I feel like I'm pretty up on, theme park lingo. But it's funny because my wife, not a big Universal fan. She admires things like you mentioned, especially the Harry Potter area and some of the things they've done recently. But she tells me that every time you go on a ride, you get spun around, you get their fire, you get water in your face. There's all these things. So I now finally have a term to describe that because to me, I mean, I love Disney. I've grown up with that. So, and I still going there soon again.
Uh-huh.
But there is it's different. I like the fact that they're using technology in kind of a way to kind of make you feel a little uneasy or out of your comfort zone a little bit. And to your point too about capacity, that's one thing that's really surprised me a little bit because I feel like what Disney built itself, especially in the 90s after they got pushed by Universal, was adding all these. I mean, they added a lot of high capacity rides, well, in the 80s at EPCOT, but then into the 90s with the Disney decade, and then you had these parks where you could go and just go on ride and ride and ride and ride. And it's really changed. And then you have like Harry Potter with the 3,000 or multiple thousand capacity.
Yes.
And those rides that probably, and I'm not sure, I wonder coming up with Star Wars, the things they're describing do not sound like high capacity rides. So how do they handle that kind of demand? It seems like there is going to be a tipping point where they have to create some Pirates of the Caribbean type rides in order to handle the crowds.
Well, I'll be a little controversial here. I think that the way that Disney used to be managed their parks was that they would try to find ways of constantly adding capacity, especially after the New York World's Fair in 64 and 65. Walt Disney and the Imagineers really learned a lot about capacity. They were starting to turn rides like Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion from walkthrough attractions to ride attractions so that they can get the bodies through it, because they recognized that that's what brought people happiness, is the ability to get through. And even if they were in a very long line, as long as the line was constantly moving, people would be able to put up with that. And then later on, they really realized that they could turn the line into the first act of the show and be able to add on to the story. They've gone a different direction, and they've created sort of an artificial lack of capacity, an artificial demand, a sense of urgency. In a way, I think it's because they can use that then to justify higher prices. For instance, every time they seem to come up with another big, huge, spectacular show, and then they put an audience seating area that they say that's going to, like a Disney California Adventure, that's going to hold 10,000 people. Well, by the time they finish designing it and building it, it really only has a capacity of 6,000 people. And then they have to then start selling fast passes, dinner packages. You ever notice that every show now has some sort of a dinner
Oh
package
yeah.
to get you a special area? So what they've done is Disney has learned that they can create a sense of shortage that then will force people to pay a premium. I think they're doing this with the buses now
Yeah.
in Florida, and that's a difference. That's a, in a weird sort of way, not so much this creating this false sense of urgency, but the tacking on of additional charges. You know, Disney was always great. Everybody was a VIP. Some were more VIP than others, but you never really ever noticed that. They may have had like a plaid person running around and giving them a guided tour, but they never stood out. At Universal, it's always been pretty easy. There's the ticket to get in. If you want to get in front of the lines, you can pay an extra amount. And if you want the VIP experience, it costs an extra amount. It's right there on the board for you. And then you just sort of do it. And now we're starting to see that Disney's starting to do these upcharges, which is, once again, I think, kind of a very Universal thing. That's another one of those sort of things. So it's an interesting combination of these two companies these days.
Yeah, it flips around itself so much. And you even have it with the people that go to the parks, because it used to be you had kind of Universal people or Disney people. And yes, you still have people that are, especially on the Disney side, that are putting their foot down. But you see, I think, a lot more movement where people are going and they're going 3 days to Disney and 2 days to Universal, or 4 and 4 or whatever. It's not so set in stone, which that's a benefit, of course, given the one downside of the fights is that the prices get so high that then everyone just has, you kind of price out. I mean, there's no right for people to go, but you do kind of change the nature of the audience a little bit, but with the prices, especially with all these extra charges.
Yeah, it is. It's. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Disneyland had a general admission price, and then you bought tickets to go on to the different rides. And if you were a lower middle class family like the one that I grew up in, my mom used to take us to Disneyland all the time. We never ate there because we couldn't afford it, so we ate like a picnic lunch that she'd put in the trunk. And we never went on any of the rides because we couldn't afford the rides, but there were some free things. And there's, of course, the wonderful atmosphere in the shows. You know, going back to what I stated earlier about the marketing guy from Universal, who said that, you know, Disney was great about selling the forest while Universal was great about selling the trees. He added to that, he says, one of the things that Disney's been able to do is if they were to burn down one of their parks, they could sell tickets just for people to come and feel the warmth. You know, and there is an affection for the Disney parks that doesn't exist with the Universal parks, still doesn't exist with the Universal parks today, but Universal's starting to put together the stories that are resonating with large audiences, and habits can change. You know, I always remember when I watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, that people are flying on TWA and Pan Am and all these companies that don't exist anymore. And in the future, what you think is the big dominant player doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the dominant player in the future. I'll give you one other strange one that just pops to mind. If you really want to figure out the difference between Disney and Universal, look at how big the bathrooms are at the Disney parks. Look at how big the bathrooms are at the Universal parks. They're at least 25% bigger by design. They wanted to make sure that there was always bathroom space at Universal, whereas Disney, that wasn't necessarily a big concern. And that was one of the design differences. It was one of these kind of, we're going to show you, we're a big, and so that was one of the things I learned a long time ago, was the bathroom size difference as a way of showing you, in a sense, the mentality between the two different companies.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because in your book, there's a great anecdote where Terry Winnick visits the MGM studios on a cast preview. And I love that, like, you know, because it's even now, like, I visited, I mean, I was only 13, but I visited the opening year. I remember going
Oh, okay.
and going in the early times and seeing that you still kind of have a bit of a, especially now because the Hollywood studios is a mess, but there's this kind of rosy view of those early years. And there was some cool stuff, but I love reading just from that guy's view about, like, well, they stole that from us. They took the exact words from us. They did all these things. And it's kind of fun to see in your book even that other perspective of, like, Universal. They studied what Disney did after Disney took some of their stuff.
Yes.
And kind of that interesting way that the two companies around that point, and especially going forward, have kind of, and you see people working for the other companies, and that is obviously going to change how things work at the different parks and how they compete. and how they get really angry and really compete, like you write about in the book.
Well, it's remarkable that in a sense, if Michael Eisner had not built the Disney MGM studio and would have just been patient and just tried to fix EPCOT at the time, instead of trying to preempt this very, very struggling effort that Jay Stein had to try to build the Florida park, if he would have just waited, it's pretty likely that Universal would not have built the Florida park. But it's the simple reason that Eisner decided he would be smarter than Lew Wasserman and preempt him by building the park that just got Lew Wasserman mad. And you just didn't make Lew Wasserman mad because Lew Wasserman was more powerful than anybody else in show business. And so a lot of the reason that Universal Studios Florida exists is because Michael Eisner made Lew Wasserman mad, and Lew Wasserman wanted to teach him a lesson. And here we are, decades later, and the lesson is being taught now by Steve Burke, who was another guy who used to work at Disney and got passed over by Paul Pressler, who's now over and runs Universal Parks, and he knows. So it's not a friendly story between the two companies. There is a lot of Hollywood bloodletting between the two. And it's that corporate culture difference is one of the things that I really honed in on Jaybangs, is really learning what it was like to work at MCA versus what it was like to work at Imagineering. And, Imagineering had all the resources in the world and millions of people working there. And Universal was like 5 guys all the time. The Terry Winnick you speak of was one of the principal designers of the first version of the Universal Studios Tour Florida, also did like the collapsing bridge in Battlestar Galactica here in California. And he went right after the park's opening. And the story that you say, the memo that I read just was, and having met Terry and interviewed him, just was making me roll on the floor, because here he is and he finds himself right behind all the main people of Disney at the time, and just finds himself in the same car, and they go through the great movie ride and they come off, and he sees that Eisner is just not a happy camper, that he spent a lot of money on the great movie ride, and that it was a real lacking ride to him. It didn't have that punch that he really wanted. And there was a real desperate look on Eisner's face. And when reading it in the memo, I'm going, there was that look, and we were all very, very kind about it until we got in the car and we're laughing our asses off. So there's that. There's other weird little stories that would never have been told. Jay told me at the beginning, I'm going to take these to the grave, but then told them to me. Jerry Weintraub, the famous producer and music manager, invited him to his house on the Pacific Coast one day, and Jay's like, I'm busy, what do you want? And, just come over, it's good, it'll be a good thing. He gets there and he finds Frank Wells, the newly installed president of Disney, Walt Disney Productions at the time, and they sit down, and Jerry's saying, guys, have a meeting. And what was happening was that Frank Wells wasn't necessarily a happy camper with Dick Nunis, who was the guy who was running the Disney theme parks and one of the guys who worked for Walt Disney from the beginning of time with the Disneyland. And he wasn't really happy with Dick, and he was trying to get rid of Dick. And he tried to do an idea that was a very Hollywood idea. And that was that Frank Wells figured, I could hire Jay Stein, who's really more like me. He's a Hollywood guy. He's a guy who actually worked in a movie studio, not just in an amusement park, but worked in the backstage areas at Universal before getting the job of running the Universal parks. So I can have a real Hollywood guy that's got a Hollywood mentality. I can also have the guy who's thinking is the one guy who really wants to build this Florida park. So I can have a guy I could trust, and who means that I'm not going to have Universal building a park that's a competitor. And they start having this discussion, and there's this helicopter that keeps flying around, and Frank Wells is getting really paranoid, wondering, what's this helicopter doing flying around? And Jerry Weintraub's going, oh, it's just Bruce Jenner. He does this all the time. He flies around and he buzzes us all the time. So don't worry about it. But Frank Wells got very nervous, then he left, and Jay did, and heard later that what the whole deal was about, that he's being offered a job that he might have taken if the offer was a bit more formal, and Frank Wells didn't run off thinking that Eisner had sent a spy after him.
That's such a crazy story, and it creates this weird alternate timeline where Jay somehow gets the job at Disney. Universal Studios doesn't open in Florida, and then who knows? What do you think, hypothetically, if Jay had the resources that he could he have worked at Disney? Because he had you talk about in the book about how he yelled a lot and he had more of that MCA culture. Could he have really just gone to Disney and just created something amazing?
Boy, I've never had anybody ask me that before, Dan. I don't know. No. I think he was very much the thing that by the time I finished the book, the thing that really captured me the most was that Jay was the embodiment of the MCA culture. There was Dr. Jules Stein, who started the company. There was Lou Wasserman, who ran the company forever and ever and ever. Welcome to downtown Los Angeles.
Yeah. We're keeping this in.
Yeah, okay. I'm in Los Angeles' very first skyscraper. That's where I live. And so it's right in the middle of downtown LA. So I feel like a big city here. It's a whopping 174 feet tall, built in 1904. But I digress.
Live from Los
That's
Angeles
live
right
from
now.
Los
Here we
Angeles. I
are.
digress. So where was I going with this? I don't. I think that one of the reasons that Jay got the job is that he was identified. He was working, and he was working in the back lot area, doing basically the scheduling of all the productions that were happening on the back lot, and where they would break up who got what set, who got what sound stage, and that he was inevitably going to become like an executive producer of movies if he kept up at that job pace. But he was offered the chance to become the president of a division of MCA at 26 years old, which was a very, very rarefied thing. So he
Yeah.
decided to take that job. It's because I think that Lou Wasserman saw him as the embodiment of what an MCA guy was. And it was that MCA chutzpah. It was that corporate culture that really, I think, set Universal apart. It was that idea of the Jaybangs. Disney would have never gotten there because that was so not Disney. For the longest time, Disney was the warm embrace, and Jaybangs is not the warm embrace. Jaybangs is literally designers like Gary Goddard knew that if he wanted to sell Jay a script, he would write on the front of the script numbered how many Jaybangs they were, and then he would put a number from a scale of 1 to 10 as to what number that is, because like a crescendo in a great concert, you've got to pace yourself, and you have to have that 5 J-bang, that 7, and then the show, boom, has that big 10 that comes to it. That's the way these guys communicated. That's not the way that the Disney Imagineers looked at designing their attractions. So that's a good question. I think that, no, he probably would have done a fabulous job just because he's a terrific guy who works really hard. But it would have been different, and in the end, you wouldn't have had this big galactic battle between two giant companies that kept the two companies on each other's toes. For a long time, Universal was really lax as they kept going through owner after owner who didn't care about the parks, and Disney got kind of fat and lazy. And I don't think Disney's trying to be fat and lazy anymore because they're looking in the rearview mirror. And there's a dinosaur on one mirror and a big gorilla on another mirror, and in that other rearview mirror is a bunch of kids on brooms, and then running alongside is Mario and his other little car with the Nintendo stuff that's coming. So it's a good time for us in the theme park as a theme park fan.
Yeah. I don't know. It is a great time, and I'm really just seeing. They just put up a picture for Tokyo, like, and it's an image of what Nintendo might be in Mario, and I was like, wow, that's gonna be something to see how they put that into Florida and Hollywood, and do they just replace kind of the kids areas? Do they really blow out a new land at Islands of Adventure? I mean, there's so many different ways they could do that. It's fascinating to think of what might have happened, because you look even at all the things that people love about Disney in the 90s, like, your Tower of Terror, or as you go further along, some of the late 90s, early 2000s things Disney did, the Animal Kingdom theme park.
Yeah.
Do those things exist without Universal being there?
Well, yeah. Those were all Disney. MGM was a reaction to Universal. Animal Kingdom was a reaction to SeaWorld and Busch Gardens in Tampa Bay. Those were MBA decisions on a business level to try to counteract what your perception of your market competition is. So those were why those parks were designed. They weren't designed because there was a story idea. They were designed to be a counterweight to what was the perceived competition, so that you never had to leave Walt Disney World's property. That was the idea of the Disney of Eisner, was that I'm going to bring you on property, I'm going to shake you upside down and never let you leave, and take every dime that you have and then put you back on the bus and you can go ahead and fly home or drive home, whatever you have to do. That was the original idea. Whether that's the idea today or not, I don't know. But now it's just a big cruise ship that doesn't go anywhere, if you ask me. But once again, I go off on these little weird tangents.
Oh, that's okay. I enjoy it because you're kind of getting, even though I have young girls and love taking them there, and they're a little too young for Universal, so there's not that pull of should I take them to do all these rides they can't
Uh-huh.
do. At the moment, they're too young for Universal, except for a few areas. And that brings me, I do want to ask you about it. Speaking of another alternative universe kind of thing, is the cartoon world idea, which
Oh,
you dig pretty. You mentioned also in your last book, but dig into this about how Jay wanted to buy, get Warner Brothers involved, and really the descriptions of what would have happened. Some of it is things that ended up in Islands of
yeah.
Adventure, but it's a very different kind of park. And I would love from your perspective, one, do you think this park, I mean, could it have existed at the level he wanted, or would it have been whittled down so much? And how much would it have pushed Disney back at that point?
Oh, if it was going to be called, the park that you're speaking of was going to be called Warner's Cartoon World, and it was going to be on the flatlands next to Universal Studio Hollywood, and it was going to be where Islands of Adventure is. And the idea of Cartoon World was it was going to be featuring the Warner Brothers cartoons in a couple of different areas. First of all, where Marvel Superhero Island is, was going to be two different areas for the DC Comics. There would be the city of Gotham, and then there would be the city of Metropolis. Metropolis is bright, happy, clean, and then it was going to be connected by a train to to Gotham, which was going to be dark and eerie. It was going to have a roller coaster that was going to be Batman chasing the Penguin as dueling coasters. It was mostly designed by Gary Goddard, and the work, I've seen the drawings and the plans for it, absolutely stunning. There was going to be the Joker's Madhouse, which was going to be this big building where the Joker's mouth, who's like 3 stories high, would open up. You walk in, and there would be different darkroom experiences with all of the different villains, the DC character villains. So there was a light side and there was a dark side to the park, kind of like what they've done with Diagon Alley, where there's sort of the happier side and the not so happy side. They were going to have that, and that was all done by Gary Goddard, and it was just absolutely stunning stuff that was going to be there. Phil Hedema and Dale Mason were in charge of the Looney Tunes area, which was going to feature things like a Space Mountain-like interior dark ride roller coaster being chased by Marvin the Martian, an audio animatronic and live actor show about Bugs Bunny teaching you about cartoon physics. You go walk off the edge of a cliff and you don't fall until you recognize you walked off the edge of a cliff and then you fall. That's cartoon physics. Um, you would have had a ride with Yosemite Sam, which would have been on little horses in a 360 theater. And at one point, Yosemite Sam would go, whoa, he went that way. And your little audio animatronic horse would turn around and you go riding the other way. It had so many different rides, and I got all the different plans, and I saw the drawings, and it was huge. And Jay was very positive that he was going to reinvent the theme park world with better characters. And through all the materials that I read, he kept showing statistically that, Mickey Mouse was just an old, tired character. Bugs Bunny is much more popular. This sort of thing. The Spider-Man ride that we see today was really initially going to be part of Cartoon World, except it was going to be an Omnimover vehicle instead of a motion vehicle, that sort of thing. And it all fell apart, once again, because of Hollywood egos, because of a negotiation between Lou Wasserman, Sid Sheinberg, and Jay on the MCA side, and two of the guys over at Warner's. At the end, Sid Sheinberg killed the deal because he had a specific number in mind. The deal didn't hit that number, and what it would have been was about $70,000 a year.
Oh,
And that's what
jeez.
ended up killing the park. Otherwise, instead of going to Marvel Superhero Island, you would have been going to DC Comics Island, and it would have been all like Superman and Spider-Man and all that kind of stuff. So it was pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. IOA is a great park, especially now they've added Kong, and I'm sure there's more coming down the way. Dudley Do Right can only last for so long, I have a feeling. But it's a great park, but it does seem like, and I know you mentioned Spielberg too, and his need to have Jurassic Park and kind of how that hurt them too, and so many egos. It's amazing that as much got done as it
That's
did.
that's what it really kind of comes down to, isn't it? It is these egos. Now, what I did find though that was fascinating, and this is to a person that worked for Jay and to Jay, was ultimately it was this very collaborative effort. And what I found as the corporate culture at MCA was that if you believed in an idea, no matter how good that idea was, you knew that your bosses were going to challenge you on it. I mean, when Jaws turned out to be such a huge hit, nobody complimented everybody. They all just complained because they thought it could have been a bigger hit, because that was the MCA culture. If you really believed in something, you would bring it up to your boss. You brought it up to Jay, or you brought it up to Lou Wasserman or Sid Sheinberg. You were going to end the fight of your life. You were going to get in a major argument. You had to defend it. They were going to ask you really detailed questions to try to trip you up. They would do everything they could. And if you could ultimately defend it, you could prevail and you could do it. And you know what? If it failed, they would look at you and they would go, just don't do that again. What other idea you got? And I think that's a different thing than maybe Disney had, is that failure was built into it, that you could try to do anything. They wanted you to be brave that way. But if you couldn't justify it, you were going to get slammed to the ground in a very, very, very brutal sort of way. So that was one of the things that allowed people to really believe in something. They could really fight for it. And as a result, you got real breakthroughs, things like Terminator 2 3D. Which is the first time you had live actors, three-dimensional screens, all this stuff all pulled together like that. You had things like Back to the Future, because that was a real fight. There was this weird collaborative element that's very Hollywood, where all these big egos would fight with each other, but at the end of the day, the best ideas would rise to the surface. Hopefully that's what I captured in Jaybangs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at some of the rides like Confrontation they had that at the time was amazing. I mean, it broke down a lot, but it was amazing. Or Back to the Future, Men in Black, some of these attractions, it's still kind of hard to believe that I mean, because attractions like that usually get budget cuts and everything, and they never did. And I could see how that would happen. So one last question,
Yes.
since we've kind of circled around what's heading going forward with Nintendo, and they've got Fast and the Furious and even Jimmy Fallon coming next
And
year.
Life of Pets,
And
too.
yeah, and the Life of Pets and more hotels and everything else. How far can, I think I may have asked you this exact question like a year or so ago, but how far can Universal push? Because probably when we talked a year ago, it was before Kong, it was before Harry Potter in Hollywood, and nothing in the past year has convinced me that they're going to pull back. It seems like they're going to keep pushing forward. I mean, how much can they really grab in terms of market share? I mean, can these parks can their parks pass the Animal Kingdom or right now before Star Wars? How far can they go? And what's the next step? What can they do?
Well, I think that there's a real belief at NBC Comcast right now that they recognize that their biggest division right now is the Parks and Resorts division. It's the one that's making the most money.
Yeah.
At Disney, Parks and Resorts, even though it's a huge part of the company, is always treated sort of like this redheaded stepchild. And, you know, the person who's usually put in charge of Parks and Resorts usually doesn't care about Parks and Resorts. They're just there to get the training so they could try to get a higher gig in the company. But at Universal, they recognize that it's a huge cash cow. It can be very profitable. They can manage it well. They have a real opportunity. I mean, they're doing what they can in Los Angeles, which is a bit more complex. But I think that there's a real belief at NBC Comcast that Disney's prime is up and over, and that Universal can be a big competitor and take more and more market share. They're proving it to themselves. They're having a higher per capita. People are spending a lot more money on buying stuff when they go to Universal than they do at Disney. And that is the big thing about theme parks. They're tending to stay an extra day at Universal, which means they're cutting usually an extra day out of Disney. As far as the attendance figures are kind of fixed. So I'm not exactly sure if Universal could pass Disney, because I think the
Right.
attendance figures are sort of fixed. They're rigged. Let's just put it that way. I
Yeah.
know the
I've heard that
process.
before.
They're rigged, because right now there's no way that Universal Studios Florida has fewer people visiting it than Animal Kingdom or Disney MGM. I'm just sorry about that. There's just no way. It's just adding up the capacity of the rides alone tells me it has a higher attendance. But with that said, where it really counts, which is the making money, getting the per capita, getting the dollars out of people before they leave, Universal is doing it. And I think that you're seeing certain desperate moves at Disney right now. There's also, in a long-term sustainability thing, something that was very inherent from the beginning. You know, Walt's idea was to buy all this land and then build some stuff on the land. And as a guy who wrote a book about EPCOT and Walt's original vision of EPCOT, it was a fairly compact development with all this extra land. When Michael Eisner came on board, he was very suburban, and he put things over here and way over there and way over there and way over there, and then had to come up with all this bus system to connect all this stuff. At Universal, it was by design by a guy named Barry Upson They have a very, very compact resort with the water taxis, and you're never on a bus very long. You're within walking distance, and even as that resort continues to grow, it grows in a very compact, sustainable sort of way, so that they don't have to spend all that money on buses and transportation. They can spend it on guest experience. It's financially a better set up model than what Disney has as well right now. So I would say this is just true. About a year ago, I would say that Universal is going to continue to fight and be kind of scrappy. I'm looking at who's running the Disney parks and who's running the Universal parks. And if I had to put money down, I hate to say it, I'm probably putting it on Universal right now.
Yeah. I can't make a strong argument against you. And if I did, we'd be going back and forth, and it would be hours. And we all only have so much time.
Yeah.
So Sam, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you.
If somebody wants to learn more about you and your books and everything, what's the best place to go online?
On Facebook, I have my own page, the Sam Gennawey page, so that's a good place. All my books are available on Amazon as either Kindle or paperback, and a couple of them are even available as audiobooks. And I also have a limited edition version of Jaybangs. It's a hardcover copy. It's limited to only 100 copies, and they'll be signed and numbered by both myself and Jay. And you can get information about that on the Sam Gennawey page.
Well, great. Yeah, and just to everyone out there, check out this book, but also especially Sam's other books, your biography of Disneyland and the book about EPCOT and the ones about Universal are all great. So thanks so much for being on the show. It was great having you back.
Thanks for being here.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Sam Gennawey. It was a blast to talk to him. He has so many interesting stories based on his research and just his experiences with Universal and Disney. And if you'd like to hear other episodes with people like Sam that also know a lot about theme parks, you can check out our archive of episodes. We've got conversations with Len Testa and Seth Kubersky. We got another episode with Sam. We got Chad Emerson. So many interesting authors, filmmakers, people that are on the web just who know a lot about theme parks. And you can also check out my blog at tomorrowsociety.com and read other thoughts from me about what's going on currently in theme parks and about the past, and reviews of books like Jaybangs. And like I mentioned earlier, I love iTunes reviews. I love ratings, mainly because they allow me to connect with more people who love theme parks. And that's what really it's all about here. Doing this because I love the industry, love going to the parks, and it's a blast to talk with all of you about it. So thanks so much for listening. Everyone have a great New Year's and holidays, and I'll talk to you all again soon.